All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 6. This week, we're going to be discussing religious terrorism. Now, there's a lot this week, so please just bear with me and hang in there. Um, okay, while religious terrorism is probably something that most of you are familiar with, even more than the state and dissident terrorism, and you'll likely see some similarities between religious terrorism and dissident terrorist. So we've been talking about this new terrorism, and religious terrorism is kind of this central feature of new terrorism, but it really isn't something new. They act like, or some people act like, religious terrorism is this thing that all of a sudden has just shown up and since 9/11, but it really isn't. It's been around forever. There's been religious terrorists and zealots, including the actual zealots, if you'll remember, pretty much forever. Okay, but Islamic terrorism has been at the forefront since 9/11. All right, so a couple of important things to remember, and consider as we, discuss religious terrorism here. The first is that even though Islamic extremism, has been really at the forefront since 9/11, every major religion has extremists within their ranks that are willing to commit acts of terror. Christianity, the Jewish faith, Hindu, Buddhist, all of them. Okay, every religion has extremists that will commit violence. Second thing to remember is that even though religious terrorists use religion, as an important part of their ideology in order to justify their actions, there's almost always some political reasons as well for their acts of terrorism. It's almost never exclusively just about religion. If you're interested in reading more about religious terrorism, Mark Juergensmeyer has a really good book called Terror in the Mind of God. And I actually use that for my graduate course that I teach on religious terrorism. And in it, he explores all the various religions, at least the major ones, and their involvement in terrorism. And I ask my classes, is religion the reason for the terrorism? Is religion not the sole purpose, but part of the problem? Or is religion not the reason for the terrorism for every religion that we cover in the course? And overwhelmingly, the consensus is always that religion plays a role in the group's use of terrorism, but is not normally the sole cause. All right, so with that out of the way, let's kind of get into the material for this week. So religious terrorism is terrorism motivated by the absolute belief that an otherworldly power has sanctioned or commanded the application of terrorist violence for the greater glory of the faith, regardless of the faith. Okay. Religion also excuses anything bad that is done because it will be forgiven because it's in defense or the propagation of the religion. And Table 6.1 in your book does a really good job of summarizing differences between religious terrorism and secular terrorism. So be sure you check that out. So as a primary motive, religion is at the core of the extremist group's political, social, and revolutionary agenda, which means that it's this driving force behind the ideology and the actions of the group or the individual. If religion is a secondary motive, it's just another aspect of the group's identity and religion. Religion, is obviously it's part of people's ethnic and national identities. But when it's a secondary motive, the ultimate goal is usually something more secular. We already talked a little bit about how religion could play a role when we talked about dissident terrorism. So, as we've mentioned several times, terrorism is a matter of perspective, okay, which can lead to misunderstandings of the causes. And one misunderstanding is the meaning of the word jihad. Okay, so jihad doesn't necessarily refer to an armed conflict, although it certainly can. The term jihad refers to a struggle, and the struggle can be either inward or outward. Greater jihad refers to the struggle within a person. Lesser jihad refers to the outward defense of Islam. So when waging jihad in the form of armed conflict, it's supposed to be defensive in nature rather than offensive. So this is where perspective comes in, right? The other misconceptions is that all Muslims are united in supporting jihad, okay? And that's simply not true. Okay, so just like followers of all the major religions, there's only a small percentage of those involved uh, in that particular religion that support terrorist or armed action. Okay, but this would be an example of religious terrorism as a primary motive. As a secondary motive, religion could play a role um, because religious and secondary secular terrorists commonly will scapegoat an adversary and sometimes use conspiracy theories to do that. One of these that is kind of perpetuated over the years is something called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Okay, and, supposedly this was discussed as a plan for followers of the Jewish faith to take over the world. Okay, and it has been used to support violence against Jewish people for many years, and you'll commonly hear this among extremists. But uh, it was confirmed, to be a fake document written by the secret police in Russia. Okay, and that's confirmed. It's not up for debate. It's been confirmed to be fake. So even though it's a known forgery and a fake, extremists continue to use it around the world to justify violence against people of the Jewish faith. All right, so every faith has extremists that commit violence in the name of their religion. In Christianity, you got the Crusades. As an example, Christian soldiers invaded, Muslim lands in the name of recapturing the Holy Lands. But there were a lot of different motivations for why people went on the Crusades. But the church at the time, gave their blessing and fully supported the missions. And there's other examples of the church engaging, in other violence as well. We talk about, Islamic terrorism. The assassins were an early Muslim terrorist group. They were from Persia, and they committed terrorist acts in Persia. And they were so deadly, I guess is the word, that some crusader leaders would actually pay them to leave them alone. Right? We'll just pay you some money, and please just go harass somebody else and go attack somebody else. In India, you have the Thuggee cult. They were worshippers of the goddess Kali, who the destroyer, and they committed robberies, would kill and mutilate people, and they were around from the 13th to the 19th century. So those are just a couple examples. And in Christianity, you also have kind of these single issue, anti-abortion terrorists. Now, I'm not talking about people that are pro-life. I'm talking about people that bomb abortion clinics and people that kill doctors, right? So you have several examples, for the different religions. All right, so Islamist extremism has been at the forefront, right, since 9/11. So one way to really look at this, because remember, it's perspective. You have to look at the whole perspective to understand, kind of what's going on. You have to look at historically what's happened in the Arab world. Okay, so since World War I, there's been kind of these three phases that the Arab world went through. There was anti-colonial nationalism, where they resisted the presence of European administrations, European forces, which were prevalent in the Middle East. There was pan-Arab nationalism, where the people that adhered to this advocated for the creation of a single kind of dynamic, united Arab republic. And then there was an era of secular leftist radicalism, which was used by activists to promote Marxism and other socialist principles. In addition to all this, you throw in the creation of the State of Israel after World War II, and that led to further disenchantment in the Arab world. Okay, so you combine these movements, who all pretty much failed, and then this view that Western encroachment with the support and creation of Israel, so it led to these new movements promoting Islamic extremism. So in their view, they had tried secular ways of reform with those three previous phases, which all failed, right? So then if you've tried these other ways, what's left? So religious aspects have gained in prominence since that time. There's an interesting section about the Holy Spirit Mobile Force and the Lord's Resistance Army in the book Make sure you read those sections as well. I'm not going to cover those because we got a lot to cover, but they're pretty interesting as well. All right, so we've pretty much covered basics of religious terrorism. So let's talk a little bit about state-sponsored religious terrorism. All right, if you're talking about state sponsors of religious terrorism, the preeminent state sponsor of religious terrorism is Iran, and they have been since around 1979 when the Shah of Iran was overthrown. They have stuff. They have groups like the Revolutionary Guard Corps that's responsible for promoting Islamic revolution in countries like Lebanon, Syria, and the Sudan. They also sponsor Hezbollah, which operates in Lebanon. So Hezbollah, as their ultimate goal, is to create an Islamic republic in Lebanon and consider Israel to be the enemy of all Muslims. They consider Iran to be like their big brother. Um, but there's other examples as well. Okay. If you look over in India and Pakistan, Muslims and Hindus have been fighting over there since probably 1947. And this is probably the one that people haven't heard of, right? You hear about what's going on in the Middle East with Iran and Israel and Hezbollah and Hamas and right all these groups, Palestine, all the stuff going on over there. But you don't hear a whole lot about what's been going on in India and Pakistan, and it's been going on for decades. So Pakistan has a long history of supporting insurgent groups that are fighting against Indian interests. So in the book, for each of these countries, there's case in point sections. So make sure you read those and understand those as well. We talk about state sponsors. All right, so dissident religious terrorism. Okay, this can be viewed from a variety of different perspectives. At a regional level, if you look at the Middle East, there's numerous examples of dissident terrorism occurring at the regional level. You have many religious sites in the Middle East that are sacred to multiple religions, and some in those religions believe that their claim to those sites is greater than other people's claims, and that the others are committing blasphemy, which leads to violent conflict. And some of these dissident terrorists believe that God wants them to drive what they consider to be non-believers from the area by whatever means is necessary. Okay, you can also look at it from a movement perspective. Okay, and example of this is the Mujahideen. They're a really good example. So the Mujahideen are Islamic fighters that have sworn a vow to use arms to defend their faith. So the modern conception of the Mujahideen started in the Soviet war in Afghanistan. Okay, those that were fighting the Soviets were responsible for spreading kind of this modern jihadi ideology around the Muslim world once that conflict got over in the 80s. Al Qaeda is a good example of organizational dissident religious terrorism. They sought to unite Muslims around the world in a holy war. And Al Qaeda is interesting because you hear it all the time about Osama bin Laden being the leader of Al Qaeda, and he was. But they're really not this traditional hierarchical organization that you think of. But really, it's a much more cellular based network. Some have described it as a dune organization. And there's an article in Blackboard about that where they operate like sand dunes. You'll have a cell that rises up, does something, and then they disappear almost as fast as they appeared. Al Qaeda is also different than many groups because they don't hold any territory. They don't champion a particular ethno-national group. They don't have top-down structure. They don't have any real state sponsorship. They've operated places, and other countries have kind of looked the other way, but they don't really have state sponsorship like what we've talked about. They have pretty vague political demands, and they're pretty much completely religious in their worldview. So they did have countries that they operate out of, Sudan, Afghanistan, but no real state sponsorship. But Al Qaeda has inspired operatives all over the world, and they've resulted in multiple spin-off groups, such as Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And ISIS is actually a spin-off of Al Qaeda as well. ISIS is an example of nation building. Okay, it was founded as a successor to Al Qaeda organization for holy war in Iraq. And as I'm sure you know about ISIS, they overran vast amounts of territory and were trying to set up a caliphate or an Islamic state with their goal of controlling the entire Muslim world. They were extremely violent, extremely brutal, and their success led other groups to begin to pledge allegiance to them. Boko Haram is one of those groups. They attempted to create an Islamic state in Nigeria. They attacked anything they considered to be Western. They were responsible for massacres, kidnappings. I don't know if you all remember this, but a couple years ago they attacked a school and kidnapped 276 schoolgirls that they were going to keep to become, quote unquote, wives for their fighters. Nigerian army has been fighting them since 2002. Beginning in the 90s, there's several Islamic terrorist groups were committing terrorist attacks in Algeria because Algeria had these elections, and when the elections didn't go the way the people in power wanted, because an Islamic group was going to win, they canceled the elections and just called them off and said, well, those weren't valid elections because the people didn't win that were supposed to win. Well, of course, that led to violence. So attacks included bombing government buildings, attacking teachers, journalists, doctors, academics. All those people were assassinated. Foreigners were assassinated, including even priests, nuns, and monks. Non-combatants were targeted for rape and murder. Like it was pretty wild in Algeria for a while. Of course, the government then waged a brutal suppression campaign, and they estimate about 120,000 people were killed between 1992 and 1997. In 1999, amnesty was offered, and about 5,000 militants surrendered. But some of the insurgents moved to other countries and set up cells to fundraise, provide weapons, and other aid for the insurgents. Pretty much some of these insurgents went other places to try to gain support for what was going on there and to get the things that they need. They also attempted to wage war against the West. So it was pretty brutal in Algeria during the 90s. Okay, religious terrorism can also take the form of internecine violence. Example of this is Iraq, because Iraq is you think about Iraq, and we always hear about just the Shia and Sunni Muslims in Iraq, but Iraq is really a multicultural nation that is majority Muslim, but consists of different Muslim sects as well as a variety of other cultures. And there has been violence, between the different sects, even between the different Muslim sects. And finally, religious terrorism can take the form of cult violence. There was a religious cult called Aum Shinrikyo, which operated in Japan, and they were a doomsday Buddhist cult that was preparing for the end of the world. And in furtherance of that goal, they released sarin gas on a subway in Tokyo. So then what is the future of religious terrorism? So that pretty much summed up the different ways that religious terrorism can manifest itself. So what's the future for this? Okay, religious terrorism has been around forever. So I would say the odds of it going away anytime are not very good. And it doesn't matter, which religion you talk about. Okay, all the religions have the propensity and the possibility for committing acts of violence. So the book has multiple questions that they talk about regarding this. So be sure that you read those and kind of think about where the future of religious terrorism is going. All right, I'm gonna stop there. I know this was a lot, and there was a lot I didn't cover that I told you need to go back and read and do on your own. So be sure you do that. Be sure you complete your assignments. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next week.